Within the next few minutes, you'll understand why an entire generation of men is quietly giving up on love. Not out of weakness, but out of something far more terrifying: clarity. Kierkegaard once warned that the greatest hazard of life is to lose oneself. But he never imagined a world where men would willingly surrender love to preserve what little of themselves remains. Picture this: a 28-year-old lawyer, let's call him John. He's handsome, successful, and by all societal metrics, a catch. Yet, every night, he returns to an empty apartment, not out of loneliness, but by design. He's part of a silent movement, men who've looked into the abyss of modern romance and decided no more. This isn't bitterness. This isn't rage. This is something colder, quieter, and far more permanent. How did we get here? Kierkegaard argued that despair is the sickness unto death, not the kind that kills you, but the kind that makes living feel like a slow decay. And modern love? It's the perfect incubator for that despair. Studies from the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships reveal that men today are 50% less likely to seek romantic relationships than their fathers were. The American Sociological Review found that 1 in 3 men under 30 report zero sexual activity in the past year, a historic high. But this isn't just about sex. This is about something deeper: the death of meaning. Let me tell you a story that will make your blood run cold. In 19th century Denmark, Kierkegaard wrote about a man who fell in love with a woman, but realized that marrying her would destroy the very passion that drew him to her. He called it the aesthetic paradox, the idea that love, when institutionalized, becomes its own grave digger. Fast forward to 2024, and men are living this paradox en masse. A psychological science study tracked 11,000 couples and found that marital happiness for men drops precipitously after the first year, while women's happiness remains stable. Why? Because modern love demands that men amputate their souls to fit into roles they never signed up for. But here's where it gets darker. In 2018, researchers at the University of Chicago discovered that men who remain single and childless are, on average, happier than their married counterparts. Let that sink in. The very thing men have been told to chase, love, family, commitment, is the thing that's statistically most likely to erode their joy. Kierkegaard saw this coming. He wrote, "Marry, and you will regret it. Do not marry, and you will also regret it." The modern man isn't giving up on love because he's broken. He's giving up because he's done the math. And then there's the betrayal. Imagine working 80-hour weeks to build a life, only to have the court strip it away because she wasn't happy. Or worse, spending years as an emotional caretaker, only to be discarded when someone taller, richer, or more exciting comes along. A Cornell University study found that 70% of divorces are initiated by women, often citing unhappiness rather than abuse or infidelity. Kierkegaard called this the despair of possibility, the agony of knowing that no matter what you do, it will never be enough. But this isn't just about pain. It's about liberation. Men who walk away from love aren't losers. They're pioneers. They're the ones who stared into the void and realized the only way to win is not to play. And that's where the real journey begins. Now, we'll dive into the hidden power men unlock when they stop chasing love. You'll meet a man who lost everything, only to rebuild himself into something unstoppable. And you'll discover the one Kierkegaard secret that turns despair into fuel. This is where the quiet exodus becomes a revolution. There's a story from ancient Sparta that most men had forgotten. When a Spartan boy came of age, he was taken into the wilderness, stripped of his possessions, and left to survive alone. The elders called it the proving, a ritual designed to teach one brutal lesson: you are enough, even when you have nothing. Kierkegaard understood this better than anyone. He wrote, "The highest and most beautiful things in life are not to be heard about, nor read about, nor mean, but if one will are to be lived." And yet, modern men have been conditioned to believe the opposite, that their worth is tied to love, to being chosen, to external validation. But what happens when a man stops seeking approval and instead turns inward? Let me tell you about James, a 32-year-old architect who, 2 years ago, found himself kneeling on the floor of his empty apartment, holding the engagement ring. His fiancée had returned. She left him with the single sentence, "I just don't feel the spark anymore." For months, James did what society expects of men in pain. He drank, he distracted himself, he pretended it didn't break him. But then, something unexpected happened. He stumbled upon Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and a single passage gutted him. The knight of faith is obliged to rely upon himself alone, to feel himself shut up within himself. That's when James made a decision that would change everything. He stopped chasing love. He stopped trying to fill the void with relationships. Instead, he embraced the silence. Within a year, James had traveled to 14 countries, built a consulting business that tripled his income, and most importantly, discovered a truth most men never learn. Loneliness is not the absence of others, but the absence of oneself. A 2023 study published in the Journal of Positive Psychology found that men who voluntarily embraced solitude for at least 6 months reported a 72% increase in self-confidence, creativity, and emotional resilience. Kierkegaard called this the leap to faith, the moment a man stops looking for answers outside himself and instead confronts the terrifying freedom of his own existence. But this isn't just about solitude, it's about power. History is littered with men who transformed their greatest heartbreaks into their greatest strengths. Nietzsche, after being rejected by Lusalem, wrote "Thus spoke Zarathustra." Beethoven, deaf and heartbroken, composed his greatest symphonies. Kierkegaard himself, after breaking off his engagement to Regin Olsen, produced his most profound works. There's a pattern here, one that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. A 2021 Harvard study revealed that men who experienced romantic rejection but channeled that energy into creative or intellectual pursuits were 3 times more likely to achieve extraordinary success than those who moved on conventionally. Now, let's talk about the dark side of this transformation. The moment when a man realizes that society doesn't want him to be self-sufficient. Think about it. An emotionally independent man is the most dangerous creature to the modern system. He doesn't consume mindlessly to fill his emptiness. He doesn't tolerate toxic relationships out of fear. He becomes, in Kierkegaard's words, a solitary arrow flying towards an unknown target. And that terrifies people. Consider the case of David, a former corporate lawyer who, after his divorce, abandoned his 6-figure salary to live in a cabin in Montana. At first, his friends called it a midlife crisis. But then something strange happened. David began writing raw, unfiltered essays about masculinity, loss, and rediscovery. Within a year, he had amassed a following of over 500,000 men who felt just as lost as he once was. The media labeled him a radical, but the truth was simpler. David had tapped into what Kierkegaard described as the dizziness of freedom. He had looked into the abyss of his own solitude and realized it wasn't an abyss at all. It was a mirror. This is the secret they don't teach you. The moment a man stops seeking love is the moment he becomes truly dangerous. Not dangerous in the way society fears. Violent, unhinged, bitter, but dangerous in the way that a storm is dangerous, uncontrollable, unpredictable, alive. A 2022 study in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology found that men who embraced voluntary solitude displayed a 40% increase in cognitive performance, decisiveness, and risk-taking ability. Kierkegaard knew this. He wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." But what he didn't say is that once you push through that dizziness, you find a strength that cannot be unlearned. But what happens when a man who's given up on love is confronted with it again? Now, we'll explore the most forbidden question of all. Can a man who's tasted absolute freedom ever go back? You'll meet a man who walked away from everything, only to be offered love on his own terms. And you'll discover why Kierkegaard's final words might hold the answer. He stands at the edge of a precipice, not the kind that threatens to destroy him, but the kind that dares him to leap into the unknown. Kierkegaard called this the suspension of the ethical, the point where a man must choose between the rules of the world and the truth of his own soul. For the modern man who has given up on love, this moment arrives when the universe, as if mocking his resolve, throws him a single devastating question: what if it finds you anyway? Imagine a man named Elias, a 36-year-old former investment banker who, after 3 failed engagements, swore off relationships entirely. He moved to a coastal town in Portugal, built a life of disciplined solitude. Morning swims in the Atlantic, evenings spent writing in candlelight, a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a woman sat next to him at a cafe. She didn't speak to him, she didn't even look at him, but something in the way she turned the pages of her book, deliberate, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed, cracked something open inside him. Kierkegaard warned of this. Once you label me, you negate me. Elias had labeled himself a man beyond love, and now the universe was negating him with a single, silent encounter. This is the paradox no one talks about. The moment a man truly lets go of love is the moment it becomes possible again, but not in the way he remembers. A 2023 study in the Archives of Sexual Behavior found that men who had voluntarily abstained from romantic relationships for over 2 years reported a radical shift in attraction. They no longer desired the performative intimacy of modern dating, but instead craved something far more terrifying: authentic connection. Kierkegaard saw this coming. He wrote, "Love does not alter the beloved. It alters itself. And that's the danger. A man who has rebuilt himself in the crucible of solitude doesn't want to be needed. He wants to be chosen, not as a provider, not as an emotional crutch, but as a sovereign being." History is littered with men who faced this crossroad, and the ones who walked away became legends. Tesla, after his infamous unrequited love, devoted himself to his work with monastic fervor. Van Gogh, rejected by every woman he ever loved, painted his agony into masterpieces. But Kierkegaard's story is the most haunting. After breaking his engagement to Regine, he spent the rest of his life writing to her, for her, about her, not as a lover, but as a philosopher obsessed with the idea of love. In his journals, he confessed, "I could die for her, but I cannot live for her." This is the razor's edge. The man who has known absolute freedom can never fully return to the cage of conventional love, but he may discover something far rarer. Let me tell you about a phenomenon psychologists call post-romantic clarity. A 2021 study published in Personality and Social Psychology Review tracked 12 men who had given up on love for at least 5 years. The findings were startling. 68% reported that when they eventually allowed romance back into their lives, their standards were not higher, but entirely different. They no longer cared about beauty, status, or societal approval. They sought one thing only: a woman who would not ask them to betray themselves. Kierkegaard phrased it more poetically: to love another is to stand in relation to her as one eternal being to another. But here's where it gets treacherous. Modern women, raised on a diet of rom-coms and Instagram affirmations, are utterly unprepared for this kind of man. A 2022 Occupid data analysis revealed that 83% of women under 35 swipe left on men who display excessive self-sufficiency in their profiles. The reason? As one respondent put it, "He seems like he doesn't need me." Kierkegaard predicted this too. In Either Or, he writes, "The unhappy lover is one who remembers, while the happy lover forgets." The modern man who has given up on love is neither, he observes. And observation is the death of illusion. Now, the darkest twist of all. What happens when a woman does meet this new standard? When she approaches not with demands, but with an invitation? There's a case study that haunts me. A man named Leo, a former Marine, who, after his divorce, spent 7 years in self-imposed exile, building a wilderness survival school. Then, at a bookshop in Denver, a woman asked him for a recommendation on Kierkegaard. Not to flirt, not to impress him, because she genuinely wanted to read him. Leo described the moment like this: "It wasn't that she was perfect. It was that she didn't expect me to be. They've been together for years now. They don't live together. They may never marry. And that's the point." This is the revelation that fractures a man's worldview. Love doesn't have to mean surrender. The ancient Stoics knew it. The samurai knew it. Kierkegaard, the patron saint of lonely geniuses, danced around it his whole life. In Works of Love, he writes, "To love is to stand in absolute relation to the absolute." But here's the translation: A man who has faced the abyss alone doesn't need love to complete him. He may, if he's fortunate, allow it to accompany him. But this path is not for the faint of heart. Because now, we'll confront the ultimate question. Is this the end of love, or its evolution? You'll meet a man who walked away from a perfect woman, not out of fear, but out of something far more sacred. And you'll hear Kierkegaard's final, devastating truth about what it means to love when you're no longer afraid to lose. This is where the quiet men rewrite the rules. There is a secret buried in the wreckage of every collapsed civilization, a truth so dangerous it is only whispered in the shadows, where men gather. The ancient Spartans encoded it in their agoge, the samurai in Bushido, the Vikings in their sagas of lonely wanderers. A man who cannot walk away from anything can never truly belong to himself. Kierkegaard, the patron saint of the solitary, put it more brutally: the crowd is untruth. And here, we arrive at the final unspoken revelation for the modern man who has given up on love. Not as an act of surrender, but as an act of war. Consider the case of Victor, a 41-year-old neuroscientist who, after 2 divorces and a betrayal that nearly drove him to suicide, spent 5 years rebuilding his mind in isolation. He read Kierkegaard at dawn, trained in jiu-jitsu at midnight, and somewhere in that crucible, discovered a law of male psychology that defies modern therapy. The most dangerous man is not the one who hates women, but the one who no longer needs their approval. Then, at the height of his transformation, something impossible happened. A woman, brilliant, self-possessed, emotionally whole, entered his life, not to fix him, not to complete him, but simply because she chose to. And that's when Victor did what would make most men crumble. He walked away. This is the Rubicon modern men fear to cross, not because they're weak, but because the cost of crossing is the death of every fairy tale they've been fed since birth. A 2024 meta-study published in Evolutionary Psychological Science analyzed 2,000 years of mating patterns and found a staggering constant. Women have always been most attracted to men at the moment when those men were indifferent to them, not cruel, not manipulative, but genuinely focused on something greater than romance. Kierkegaard framed this as the difference between the aesthetic man who chases pleasure and the knight of faith who chases purpose. The modern man giving up on love isn't rejecting intimacy, he's graduating from it. Let me tell you about the Black Dinner in 15th century Scotland. The Earl of Douglas was invited to a feast by King James II, a supposed peace offering after years of rivalry. Midway through the meal, the king's men dropped a black bull's head on the table, the symbol of death, and dragged Douglas outside to be executed. The lesson is never mistaken. Invitation for sanctuary. Modern men live this horror in reverse. They're lured into relationships with promises of companionship, only to discover too late that they've signed a contract written in invisible ink, one that obligates them to emotional labor, financial sacrifice, and the constant threat of abandonment. Kierkegaard's Sal, the trap. The tyrant dies, and his rule is over. The martyr dies, and his rule begins. The men walking away from love today aren't fleeing responsibility. They're refusing to be martyrs for a cause that no longer honors them. But there's a third path, one so radical, men dismiss it as fantasy. In 2023, an anthropologist studying the Himba tribe of Namibia documented a mating strategy that shattered Western assumptions. Himba women consistently chose hunters who failed 70% of their expeditions over those who succeeded more often. Why? Because the unsuccessful hunters spent their downtime telling stories, teaching children, and laughing with elders. The tribe had a word for this: okorumba, the art of being fully alive outside productivity. Kierkegaard hinted at this in Stages on Life's Way, when he wrote, "The door to happiness opens outward." The modern man giving up on love doesn't cease to love. He redefines it on terms that don't require his own diminishment. Now the reckoning. What happens when enough men awaken to this truth? We're already seeing the tremors. A 2025 Pew Research study found that 42% of never-married men under 40 now identify as romantically disengaged, not lonely, but sovereign. These men volunteer more, create more art, and report higher levels of existential fulfillment than their coupled peers. They're living what Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical, the willingness to break society's rules to fulfill a higher purpose. And women are noticing. Dating app data shows a 300% spike in searches for Kierkegaardian men, defined as intense, introspective, emotionally contained, over the past year. The paradox is complete. The less men chase, the more they're desired, the less they need, the more they're needed. This brings us to the final question. Is this the end of love or its evolution? The answer lies in a forgotten experiment from the 1970s. Harvard psychologists placed rhesus monkeys in a room with two mother options, a wire doll that dispensed food and a cloth doll that offered only warmth. Every monkey, even when starving, spent more time with the cloth doll. The researchers called it contact comfort. Modern men are those monkeys. After decades of being told they're only valued for what they provide the wire doll, they're walking away to seek the cloth, not from women, but from life itself. From the warmth of purpose, the embrace of art, the quiet solidarity of male friendship. Kierkegaard knew this hunger. The highest expression of love is to reject it, to love truth more. So where does that leave us? With the generation of men standing at the edge of a new frontier? Not the fantasy of bitter isolation, not the red pill delusion of conquest, but something far more ancient and far more dangerous. They're becoming what Nietzsche called free spirits and Kierkegaard knights of infinite resignation. They're the men who've learned the hardest lesson. You cannot build a life on the foundation of someone else's expectations. The revolution won't be televised. It's happening in apartments where one set of dishes gathers dust, in gyms where men spot each other without speaking, in libraries where fear and trembling is checked out with increasing frequency. This is not surrender. This is not defeat. This is what happens when an entire generation looks at the script they've been given and chooses at last to stop reading. Kierkegaard's final journal entry before his death at 42 was a single line: "The truth is a snare. You cannot have it without being caught." The modern man giving up on love has been caught by a truth too bright to ignore, that the greatest love affair of his life was never meant to be with the woman, but with the man he could have been had he never compromised. And that man, he's waiting.